Thank you. So I hope you can all see the slides and hear me okay. And thank you very much for the invitation. It's been really fascinating to listen to the presentations. So the title of this talk is Creating Civic Media, and it's about developing a digital media system that actually serves the interests of people and communities. Because so much of the discussion we have about digital media is now caught up in trying to put out the digital fires, like disinformation on social media or harassment and hate speech and so on. And while, of course, we must put out the digital wildfires, we also need to try to think about how do we build environments where these fires are less likely to start in the first place. And in that context, the talk is loosely structured around three topics: design, regulation, and empowerment. And in particular, it has a focus on the European Union and European policy. So I'll start with design and drawing a parallel between the development of broadcasting in the 1920s and the development of the web in the 1990s. Now, from a technical point of view, these technologies share very little in common, but both developments were accompanied by a kind of revolutionary sense of potential of how they could serve the public. In the UK, the BBC's first Director General, John Reith, described the corporation's responsibility to use this new technology to carry into the greatest possible number of homes everything that is best in every department of human knowledge, endeavour, and achievement. Then 70 years later, a similar grand ideal was applied to the advent of the web. The then US President Al Gore described the web as an information superhighway that can save lives, create jobs, and give every American, young and old, the chance for the best education available to anyone. Now, a major difference lies in the expectations of how these public goods would be realized. In the case of broadcasting, many recognized that public goods would not just come automatically from new technologies and certainly not from commercial markets. Public goods had to be cultivated and structures had to be designed that would promote those public goods. And that is the basis of the public sector broadcasting model. And for all its flaws, and that model definitely has a lot of flaws, the virtue of public broadcasting is that from the beginning, it addressed people as citizens, not consumers, and tried to think about what do citizens need and how do you develop cohesive societies. In contrast, the expectation surrounding the early web was that public goods would just flow naturally from commercial interests. And on this view, the duty of states was to allow business to flourish with minimal regulation. And the business has certainly flourished, but the public goods are much harder to identify. For example, it's notable that among the world's most popular websites, Wikipedia is the only non-commercial entity and the only one that comes anywhere close to the ideals around knowledge and education envisioned by Reith and Gore. So in contrast to Wikipedia, the most popular social media platforms are designed to accumulate engagement. From a user perspective, that means infinite scrolling through content and the disorderly presentation of content to maintain cycles of anticipation and reward. Gamification aims to keep users locked in, while push notifications draw them back should they stray away. And all of this serves the ultimate goal of harvesting data and capturing attention that can be resold to advertisers and other data companies. And some of this has been touched on already. So there's little doubt that these design features are intentional. Leak after leak from the tech companies' internal documents make it clear that they are fully aware of how destructive their platforms are. A leaked Facebook presentation from 2018 acknowledged our algorithms exploit the human brain's attraction to decisiveness. Just yesterday, a leaked internal document acknowledged we're not actually doing what we say we do publicly. And this scandal revealed that high-profile users or VIP users were allowed to spread conspiracy theories and hate without sanction because they wanted to keep those users on the platform. So that brings us to regulation, or the lack of it. What all these leaks underscore is that the underlying principle exempting platforms from content liability is absurd. Platforms clearly do not play a neutral, merely technical and passive role towards content, as specified in the EU's e-commerce directive from 2000 and in US legislation previous to that. Yet they continue to be regulated as though they are neutral platforms, and they lobby hard to maintain those protections. The tech industry now spends more on lobbying the EU than the pharmaceutical or financial sectors, at around 100 million annually. So last year, the EU updated its e-commerce directive with a new Digital Services Act. And contrary to expectations, this did not reverse the platform's exemption for content liability. Instead, it will introduce a new set of monitoring obligations for very large platforms. They'll be obliged to conduct risk assessments and to undertake reasonable and effective measures to mitigate those risks or face sanctions through fines. Now, a lot of that sounds like a step towards progress, but it's worth considering what current monitoring programs actually look like. In 2018, the EU established a self-regulatory code of practice for disinformation, and that was signed by major online platforms that you see listed here and representatives of the advertising industry. And these signatories were asked to adopt measures to disrupt advertising revenues for disinformation, the prevalence of fake accounts, to make political advertising and micro-targeting more transparent, and so on. But the European Commission's own assessment of the code in May 2020 concluded that while it had been successful in establishing this common framework, which is really just another way of saying it was successful because it brought these companies all around the same table, there were significant shortcomings. Because it's self-regulatory, there is no means of sanctions, so there's very poor compliance. The platforms themselves, when they implemented actions, it wasn't uniform, and many of the key concepts that underpin the code were poorly defined. So in other words, the Commission has repeatedly told the platforms that what they are doing is not satisfactory. And I think some of this comes to the point Stephen just mentioned a moment ago about political will and whether there is a political will to do more. So in response to COVID-19 disinformation, the Commission then established a monitoring program around COVID-19 where the 6 platforms were asked to deliver transparency reports on their policies and actions. And here you can see the areas that the signatories were asked to report on, such as the promotion of authoritative content, improving your user awareness, and so on. But importantly, in all of these areas, the key ask was that platforms provide data about the EU and breakdowns for EU member states, so that whether it's researchers or civil society organizations or policymakers in EU countries could actually understand what was happening in their own countries. So this week at the Fujo Institute, we'll be publishing a report on that monitoring program. And in summary, we found when we analyzed all of these platform reports was that they were highly repetitive, they were often irrelevant, and they generally failed to provide the data that was requested. For example, as I said, the Commission specifically requested data about the EU and EU member states. But of the 1,114 actions we identified, only a third of those were stated to even apply to all EU countries. And no information at all was provided about the regional application for 40% of the actions reported by the signatories. So in other words, we didn't know if those actions applied to the EU, some EU countries, the US, or somewhere else. In some cases, they reported on things that were just completely irrelevant to COVID-19 and disinformation. And to give you an example of what that is, and almost a quarter of the reports by Facebook and Twitter were completely irrelevant. And that included things like, we launched a workshop for startups to help them improve their marketing. It clearly has nothing to do with COVID-19 or disinformation. Twitter included a lengthy description of a new emoji to commemorate Holocaust Memorial Day. So these are the types of things they were just shoving into these reports to pad them out. Often they just took that month's press releases and put it into the report without any effort to tailor it for disinformation or the EU. And when we tried to verify whether what they had reported was actually implemented, we found that even basic actions like applying a label to content about COVID-19 just weren't applied or were applied incredibly inconsistently. And what that suggests is that they lack the capability to do what they say they are doing. For example, as you see in the images here, TikTok said it was prioritizing authoritative information from sources like the WHO. And the idea was that when people search for something related to COVID-19 or vaccines, they should get back reliable sources of information. But a simple search for the term vaccine in June 2001, these were the top search results. So claims that a child has been seriously harmed by the Moderna vaccine, and another video urging nurses to not get vaccinated. And it's important to note that we're reviewing content in the English language, and technical capabilities tend to be most developed for English. So if the implementation is really problematic in English, we can expect that it's much worse in other languages. And so given all that, it seems clear that more transparency reporting and more monitoring reports is not the answer to anything. The EU Code of Practice has been in place for 4 years now, and these are the types of things the platforms are still submitting to the EU, supposedly in fear of regulation coming down the road. So finally, that brings me to the empowerment part. And the big platforms love to talk about empowerment and communities and how they empower communities. In the reports we reviewed, they described efforts to promote media literacy and to make users aware of reliable sources and so on. But they didn't report anything about the efficacy of those actions and whether or not they're effective in any way to reduce the spread of disinformation. In contrast, there is an abundance of research and innovative projects that do aim to genuinely empower citizens and communities. And unlike the platforms, this work is open to evidence, critique, and refinement. For example, there are countless media literacy initiatives. I think the next presentation, John Cook will talk about his work on critical thinking and inoculation. My colleague Jane Souter spoke about citizen assemblies. There are proposals for social media councils where citizens and civil society representatives would come together to participate in content moderation decisions. All of these things are open to debate and evidence. What the platforms are doing is completely lacking any transparency and accountability. So considering all of this, the question then is, how do we build these types of ideas, or some of the points Stephen was making about how to make people aware of micro-targeting? How do you build those into digital spaces? So one way would be to get or ask the platforms or demand that the platforms incorporate them themselves. But based on everything that has happened so far, it seems extremely unlikely that that will happen. Another way is to start building and supporting alternative platforms that are designed for the public interest. Earlier this year, an excellent book on A Guide to Social Media was published, and it has 11 chapters, all on social media platforms, none of them called Google or Facebook or Twitter. Instead, they are all small platforms based in cities and regions from all over the world, where they serve as public infrastructures. They are not designed to make money. They are designed to serve public needs. And crucially, what the authors argue is that if we want to build a better environment, we need a vision that looks beyond the Facebook and the Google. For example, if you think about digital spaces as public infrastructures, is similar to thinking about libraries as community infrastructures and how they serve roles. And the library and, say, a bookshop are not in competition with each other. They have a different vision, they have a different role. The kinds of civic-minded spaces that are referred to in this book do not aim to replace Facebook. They're offering people something else. But civic-minded individuals who develop these types of platforms can only do so much on their own. Regulators have a key role to play here. So some of the things that regulators could do would be to invest, if these civic-minded spaces are to thrive, would be invest in civic innovation and not just commercial innovation. In Europe, policymakers talk a lot about the digital single market that's almost always conceived of in a commercial way. They can introduce rules that break the stranglehold on big tech by forcing them to adopt data portability and interoperability rules so that it's easy for people to leave and join platforms without losing all the contacts and networks they have developed. It would mean extending rights and protections in the online environment, such as proposals for the recognition of data rights and collective data rights. It means new standards for digital content where verification is built in. And achieving all of that means linking up discussions about internet governance and policy to the kind of social innovations that I cited earlier. And obviously, none of these things will happen overnight. And they will only partially address concerns about disinformation and post-truth culture. But unless there's some positive vision for the future, then I don't think we're going to get very far trying to patch up the existing platforms. Oh, I missed the last slide. So to conclude and return to the title, when we talk about the design or regulation of digital platforms or efforts to empower citizens, we must keep in mind that what we want to achieve in the long term. And that's not to give in to the lie that Facebook, Google, and Amazon own the internet and that we're stuck with the world they give us, because they don't own it and we're not stuck with it. I mentioned earlier that Wikipedia is the only non-commercial entity among the most popular websites. And in terms of truth and knowledge, Wikipedia does something really interesting. It shows us a radical alternative to the book. And as David Weinberger has argued, books are necessarily limited, and that served us very well for centuries, but now we have alternatives through networked knowledge. For example, books can only fit in so much information. Someone, and it's usually just one or two people, make a choice about what to leave in, what to put out. If those people are biased, if their research is poor, that ends up in the book and it gets put into an academic library where it is locked up and kept away from the masses. In contrast to that, Wikipedia, aside from being free, exposes this complex truth about knowledge and how it is debated and contested. It flags disputes, it tells readers when there are disagreements about a subject, and it explains that disagreement. It reveals sources, it flags poor sources, it tells people this source is not reliable, there needs to be better sources. It also tells people, don't trust us, you need to think for yourself. So I think, as has been mentioned previously about relativism and postmodernism, models like Wikipedia track something between that institutional expertise where knowledge is locked up and confined by elites and the postmodern free-for-all that we're all trying to avoid. And I should note also that studies have shown that Wikipedia pretty much measures the Encyclopedia Britannica in terms of the accuracy of its science articles. So like public sector broadcasting, Wikipedia isn't perfect, but it gives us a model of what a nonprofit truth-seeking space can achieve and what people can achieve if they have the supports to explore the possibilities of technology. But tragically, Wikipedia in 30 years of the web is the only nonprofit website in the top 100. And that's what we need to change. Thank you.